Good evening, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. It is 6:31, and I want to welcome you all here to HealthyU, a series of conversations. It is a monthly program that we offer in our Parks and Rec department, and it's a very important one. And I want to thank all of you people for coming out tonight. This is a tough topic. HealthyU talks about a number of tough topics. I see some repeat people here tonight who can attest to that. And these conversations are never easy to have. Last month's topic was on the opioid epidemic that is a public safety crisis in our country right now. That's not an easy topic. I just wanted to share a little bit. My name is Patty Roberts. I am with the Parks and Recreation Department. I really am honored and thrilled and privileged to be here. And I see all of the bravery on the faces of the people who are here tonight. And I want to thank you for doing that, for coming out. A few general housekeeping items just before we get started. At the table over there by the food and drink is a voluntary sign-in. No one's required to sign in, okay? And lastly, there will be an opportunity for questions at the very conclusion of our presentation. Just raise your hand. I'm going to move as soon as I'm done here. Our presenter is going to come sit here, and she's the subject matter expert. I am not, but I will move out into the audience because we are recording this session that will be available on our website for people who couldn't make it tonight. And so when I sit out in the audience, in order for the question to be heard on the recording, I will hand you the microphone so that you can go on and be heard on that. And then Ms. Posey will respond back to your question, okay? Help yourself to the food and drink that our staff was very kind to offer. And last thing is restrooms are available, and they're located directly south of the lobby. So just go out here and take a left, and you can ask guest services if you need further direction from there. HealthyU is a program that's very near and dear to my heart. And we do, like I said, we talk about tough topics. Some of the topics that we've talked about are depression, anxiety, domestic violence, that was a real tough one, trauma-informed care, suicide awareness, which is what we're here tonight for, and the opioid epidemic awareness. Those are tough topics to have, to open that dialogue. But I have found, and I'll give you a brief background on me, that if we don't talk about them, we can't heal. We cannot heal. And I know for myself, when I was going through it, it also caused a very sense of isolation for me. I lived for 8 years thinking that I was the only one and my child was the only one going through the opioid epidemic, and that is so not the case. So unless we talk about these, we really can't heal. Just a brief background about 1,480 days ago, and yes, I still count in days, my son, Danny Roberts, 22 years old, died of a heroin overdose that was laced with fentanyl. And for me, and how I found out is a police officer arrived at my door on Saturday morning on the 18th of August of 2018 to advise us that my son was dead. And what the important thing to me is of this message is many things, but one of which is Danny died right here in Port St. Lucie. He did not die in Orlando. He did not die in Miami. He did not die in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He died right here in Port St. Lucie. So these problems are right here in our community, and we need to face that. We need to talk about it. But we'll learn more a little bit about Danny's story, because it was not a one night deal, as many of you know, with substance use or any mental health topic. But for now, I do want to, because this is, well, if I may just share a little bit more, because tonight might be for myself, not for Ms. Posey, But I might have to, because of my injury and my inability to drive, I might have to cut out just a little bit early from this evening. I hope Ms. Posey is fine, and our guest services is more than able to help and assist with this. I apologize, but I simply cannot drive at this point. As I told you, my 22-year-old son died. But again, it wasn't a one-off experience. Danny had fought and struggled for 8 years with substance use and other mental health issues. Now, I understand I am not an Ann Posey. I'm not a subject matter expert. I am a mother who went through it for 8 years. But his substance use disorder, of course, was, which I understand is fairly common, was mixed with a couple other mental health disorders. One of which was depression, and the other was, the primary one was anxiety. He first presented with his anxiety in high school. He was out of a minimum of 14 rehabs and recoveries in the state of Florida, never outside Florida, but in the state of Florida. And my husband and I, his family, were there every step of the way with him. And, you know, we fought for him, we fought with him, we fought against him. But at the end of the day, after 8 years, Danny is dead. And I've sat in countless family sessions at several rehabs or recovery centers, and it's heartbreaking. It really is. The dozens of young men, and I think if I'd had a daughter, it would be young women, share with the group how miserable they are. I mean, think about it. How many young people, when the first grade teacher asks the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? How many people raise their hand and say, I want to be alienated from my family. I want to lie. I want to steal. I want to go to jail. Those are not things a young person aspires to be. And yet that's their life. And that's what they're fighting for, is to not have that life. And addiction to me isn't fair. I mean, why my son caught it and my neighbors didn't, that's always going to be a mystery to me. But I really do believe, and that's why I'm telling this story, is because that fateful Friday night when Danny pulled out of my driveway for the last time that I would see him, I believe that he did not want to continue living like he was. He had told me that several times, that he hated the cycle of, you know, clean one day, relapse, recovery, and it was just it was an over and over cycle. And he didn't want that. He hated it. He wanted to live a normal life, but he just couldn't. But it showed me, his 22 short years showed me this. The concepts of nature versus nurture go completely out the window when an opioid is involved, because he was raised with scruples and morals, and he knew right from wrong. He was kind, thoughtful, had a wicked sense of humor, but when he was faced with an opioid versus getting dope sick, he turned to the lure of the opioid. Now, there's a ton of research on addiction and mental illness that results from substance use or because of it. But I just would throw out 2 facts that were, one of the best books I read was by Beth Macy, and the title is called Dope Sick, and it does talk a lot about mental health and the opioid epidemic. But 2 facts stood out to me in her book. And that is that the average non-addicted person's perception of the future is calculated to be 4.7 years. That makes sense to me. I can probably see out about almost 5 years from today. However, for an addicted user's idea of the future, it's 9 days. 9 days. That was Danny's perception of the future, is, oh my God, 9 days ahead. That's nothing. That's their reality. That is what they live with every day. And one day when he was in what I call remission, because to me, for me, the way I have been educated on this, it is a disease like no other, like heart condition, like diabetes. But I had asked him when he was in remission, what came first, the substance use disorder or mental health, or the misuse of opioids? And he had to think long and hard about that one. And he looked right at me, and he felt very strongly that his mental health issues, for him, anxiety presented first. And then he self-medicated after that. So those are some of the facts that I have learned on my journey through this. And that's why HealthyU was actually kind of born. Because again, for 8 years, I sat at my house thinking, I'm the only one going through this. And that is so far from the truth. That is not true. And maybe if we had talked about it, and if Danny had talked about it, maybe we would have had a different outcome. But we didn't. And so that's why I want to have these conversations, why it's important, why brave people like you come out to hear our subject matter experts. We hold these monthly. But as I said at the top of the hour, I am not your subject matter expert on any of these topics. That's why we have women or presenters like the one on my right-hand side who come out on their own and present on their areas of expertise. We have a phenomenal community of healthcare providers on the Treasure Coast. HealthyU is going in its 3rd year, and I have never struggled, knock on wood, but I have never struggled to find a highly qualified presenter to come in and share his or her expertise on a subject matter, on a subject. So all I would offer out is one of the questions I do get with HealthyU. It's been a long time since I've gotten this one, but I do get, why HealthyU, mental illness conversations and parks and recreation. And the first time I was presented with that question, it was pretty point blank to me. I looked at the person, and I did not mean any disrespect. And I just said, why ever not? I mean, parks and recreation, we are your connectors. We offer, we've got our banners out here. We offer all the programs and events and conversations like these. That's what we're here to do. We're here to serve. So why would we not talk about mental health or health in general to our community who are asking us for that help? I would also offer out, we do have our brochure out here, because the majority of what we do is free, just like tonight is. It's free to the public. Our events are all free to the public. I am not here, and never have been, and Ms. Posey can attest to that. Nobody from my staff has ever been at one of these HealthyU sessions and ever promoted selling of any service that we offer. That is not why we're here. I'm not here to sell you a fitness, look at me, I'm not a fitness person, but I'm not here to sell you a fitness membership, but I am here to tell you that you have 48 beautiful parks and facilities in Port St. Lucie. If nothing else, get out and move. Get out and move. I cannot move the way my counterpart in the fitness center can, but I can tell you what, when I walk to my mailbox and back, I feel a little better. Just a little better, okay? Go out to the parks. They will revive you. They will help you. So that's just a little bit about why I am here and why I believe so strongly in this program. Opening up the dialogue. And what I would like to do next is to introduce our subject matter expert. And the presenter's name is Ann Posey. She is a licensed medical health care provider. Mental health counselor, knew I missed that one. And she is the regional director of the Behavioral Health Center at Cleveland Clinic, Florida. Ann Posey started with the Behavioral Health Center at Cleveland Clinic, Indian River Hospital in November of 2017. And she was promoted to the role of regional director of behavioral health in October of 21. Ms. Posey is a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida, and she is a nationally certified counselor. She has over 25 years experience in behavioral health care, having worked in inpatient, residential, and outpatient settings. She has a calling for ensuring that those consumers with behavioral health needs in the community get the best possible care available. Ms. Posey has been part of the executive leadership in several agencies that impact the adults and youth with behavioral health needs, including psychiatric hospitals, community mental health, child welfare, and juvenile justice systems. Program development and innovation is a passion for Ms. Posey. Championing and implementing telepsychiatry across the Cleveland Clinic, Florida region has allowed patients experiencing a mental health crisis to receive the quality care in a timely fashion. This has resulted in more use of the psychiatry consult service, as well as better patient outcomes and satisfaction. So that is all about our presenter. I would also offer out, I believe this is your 4th visit to HealthyU. She is a huge supporter of HealthyU. She's also a subject matter expert on depression, anxiety, on substance use disorder. She is a SME like no other. So I appreciate Ms. Posey's support of HealthyU. And I know that you will, through her presentation tonight, you will learn, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. And without further ado, here is Ms. Posey.
Thank you. I'm always so moved by your story, and I always just really appreciate you taking your time to share that personal story, because I know it means a lot to everybody else as well. So thank you for doing that, Pat.
Absolutely. I will say this much, there are people who say, well, it's been 4 years. Does it get easier? It never gets easier, ever, ever, ever. I see some familiar faces here from we had our last Wednesday night's International Overdose Awareness Day event right here in Port St. Lucie. It was our 2nd annual, and we had it over at Veterans Park at Rivergate. And I had people there who had loved ones that have lost their loved ones years ago. And they are it's just as raw today as it was when it happened. So thank you, Ann, for saying that.
So thank you for having me. As Pat said, I am a licensed mental health counselor. I work with Cleveland Clinic. I've been around, though, this community for a very long time. I started with Lawnwood Hospital, worked there for about 12 years. I did some time working in child welfare for a few years, then New Horizons of the Treasure Coast Community Mental Health. And I've been with Cleveland now for about 5 years. So I've really seen behavioral health in this community from a variety of different aspects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about suicide awareness. This is National Suicide Awareness Month. So I think it's important to understand the facts about suicide, to talk about it. I actually taught, and I'm going to talk at the end a little bit about mental health first aid, which I actually spent 6 hours teaching today. So if my voice is a little hoarse, you'll understand why, and to talk a little bit about that. So we know that 12.2 million adults seriously thought about suicide this past year. That's a pretty high number. And about 3.2 million adults made a plan. So we know that for a lot of people, when they feel hopeless and helpless and aren't sure what to do, suicide becomes an option for them. 1.2 million of those 12.2 million people actually attempted suicide. And for every one person who dies by suicide, about 25 people attempt. We know that suicide rates among men are 4 times higher, are successful. Sorry, I'm going to change that language. That people who die by suicide, men die 4 times more often than women. That's usually because they use more lethal means than women, and women actually attempt suicide more often than men. People 85 and older currently have the highest suicide rates. We call these deaths of despair. We've really seen this since the pandemic. During the pandemic, where people were more isolated, they were unable to get out and do things that our senior population helps connect them. Sometimes church or their families, etc. A lot of health issues, A lot of people, in their peer groups might have been dying from COVID. We really saw that suicide rate amongst the elderly spike. And they actually had created a term for it called deaths of despair. In 2020, Florida suicides decreased, but they've risen again in 2021 to about 14%, which is pretty high. So we know that we kind of have a second kind of pandemic on our hands. So what about COVID? We talk a lot about COVID. I know people are tired of hearing about COVID, but I think the stress of COVID, it's important to think about what the stress of this pandemic has done to us. 4 in 10 adults reported symptoms of anxiety during the pandemic, and that's up from 1 in 10. So, that's a big percentage of increase of people who reported anxiety and depression. And we know that the stresses of the pandemic, so a pandemic it's a crisis, and it's considered a traumatic event. And it's not really a traumatic event that's over yet. So anytime we see a traumatic event, you're going to see a spike of anxiety and depression. And you usually will see that anywhere from 18 months to 2 years after the event is over. And we call that the mental health surge. So we saw it after 9/11. We saw it after Hurricane Katrina. And we know and are already seeing it now after COVID and after the pandemic. Suicide and deaths increased during the course of the pandemic, especially for males between the ages of 10 and 34. Suicide deaths for people of color also increased. And actually, for adolescents, Black adolescent male suicide rates have increased the most. Christine Moiter, an MD, she said an individual's personal risk factors combined with precipitants such as experiences of isolation, depression, and anxiety, economic stress, which we saw a lot of that during the pandemic, suicidal ideation, and access to lethal means may lead to periods of increased risk of suicide. So what we saw, the pandemic is like that perfect storm. We saw people faced with large amounts of stress. We saw people faced with economic stress. We're seeing that continued economic stress today, with our current economy. And then we're seeing more access to lethal means. I always say I love Florida. So we rank 48th in healthcare. 48th in mental health care and access to mental health care. And we rank 3rd in gun sales. So that's not a great combination, right? But, we've got we need to have our guns. We do a Florida youth risk survey in Florida, and the 10-year trend, they just released the 10-year trend from 2009 to 2019. And basically, I'm not going to read every one up, but everything increased. Kids feel more sad and hopeless. They have considered suicide. They've made plans. Have purposely hurt themselves without wanting to die, which we call self-injurious behavior, non-suicidal self-injurious behavior, cutting, and attempted suicide. So everything has increased in the last 10 years. We've seen a significant increase amongst our kids, which means that people don't cope as well. They don't have those coping strategies to deal with the increased amount of stress. I mean, how many people in this room have felt the increased amounts of stress in the last 5-10 years, right? Me. I walk into work every day and I'm like, oh my gosh, when am I going to say I work in healthcare? So, it's craziness in healthcare. So let's talk a little bit about myths about suicide. We don't talk enough about it. We don't talk enough about behavioral health and mental health. And we talk about other things, right? We talk about cancer a lot. There's a nice big walk. Everybody wears pink, right? For breast cancer. People go out, we raise tons of money for it. And people will, I see it all the time on Facebook. People talk about their journeys with breast cancer. I don't see that quite so much with mental illness. Let me wear, or purple for overdose, right? People aren't out there wearing those colors so much. But think what could happen if we did. If we treated mental illness or depression or anxiety just like we do some of these other medical illnesses, think about the research we could do. Think about the impact we could have. It could be amazing. Okay, so myth or fact? I want you all audience participation here. Suicide only affects individuals with a mental health condition. True or false? False, right? So sometimes people feel suicidal because of situational things. Something might happen. I just saw that the CFO of Bed Bath and Beyond died by suicide, right? Probably there's something maybe has gone on financially, might be facing some legal trouble. Right. Yeah, right. So maybe he doesn't have a diagnosed mental illness, but maybe he feels hopeless and like there's no way out, right? Sometimes when people are diagnosed with a significant medical condition, cancer or something along those lines, they'll have a period where they feel suicidal initially because they don't know what they should do, even though they may have never struggled with mental illness. But we do know that 90% of people who die by suicide do have a diagnosed mental illness. So it is a pretty high number of people who die by suicide do have a diagnosed mental illness. 90%. Most suicides happen suddenly and without warning. True or false? False, right. Most of the time, people are going to give a lot of warning signs. Most of the time, people will talk about it. They'll show symptoms of depression, signs and symptoms of something going on, or anxiety. They may have sleep problems. They may struggle with their emotions. They may use substances. They may give things away. And I'll talk about some warning signs to look for in a little bit. But generally, people give a fair amount of signs and symptoms. And most people, the majority of time, people who die by suicide have usually attempted somewhere around 3 times prior to ending their life by suicide. You're catching my language because I'm old, and sometimes I use old language, but I'm going to talk specifically about language. So I'm really trying to catch myself and not use stigma producing language. I still slip into it sometimes. Talking about suicide with someone will give them the idea. No. I teach mental health first aid, and one of the things that I really like about that is one of the things we really teach is that is such a myth, and that if someone is thinking about suicide, it's happening in the dark, and if you ask them about it, it brings it into the light or shines a light into that dark place. So if we don't ask people about it, it happens alone. They're thinking about it alone. And if we ask them, sometimes it allows them to feel great relief that someone has actually brought up what they've been thinking. All right. And they don't feel so alone or so isolated. People will say, well, I thought I was going crazy. That's why I wasn't telling anybody. And when somebody says, are you feeling that you want to kill yourself? And they actually use those words, it can cause them to feel great relief and feel like somebody cares about them. You can't put the idea in their head by asking them the question. Once a person is considering suicide, there's nothing you can do. True or false? Right. Yeah, that's false. No, it's really false. Actually, by talking with someone about how they're feeling, you can help them create a plan for safety. And most of the time, when you talk with someone, you can actually help save their life, right? Talking about it gives people hope and gives them the ability to make a plan for safety as opposed to a plan to end their life. Yes. Oh, I need to sit. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. There you go. So suicide occurs in every socioeconomic group. True or false? True. Yep. We actually have seen that recently. So Naomi Judd, right? Richer than rich. Struggled with depression her whole life and ended her life by suicide. Robin Williams, although I will tell you, I do think Robin Williams, while he had a diagnosed mental illness, I do think Robin Williams, he was diagnosed with what was called Lewy body dementia right before he made that decision, which is a significant medical issue with long-term consequences, which may have contributed to that decision. We do know that though there is a higher prevalence in some lower socioeconomic groups, because they often don't have access to some of the treatments that other people have, but it's prevalent in all groups. Improvement following a suicidal crisis means the risk of suicide is over. No, there's actually a really high risk point when a person is so depressed and they seek treatment and maybe get on antidepressant medication. It actually increases their risk for a little bit because they may get energy, feel better. And so when someone seeks treatment, really as a family member, it's kind of, or a friend, might be the time to wrap more supports around them, because their risk can actually go up for a little bit while they may get that energy to carry out something that they've thought about. So we want to be aware of that. I talk to doctors about this quite a bit. A lot of times when people are depressed, the first place they go is their primary care physician. And two of my colleagues are here that work with the primary care doctors at Cleveland so that we can connect them with behavioral health care. So we don't just start them on medication and send them on their way and look at that risk to increase, because that's not what we want to have happen. All right, so let's think about how we identify the risk. How do we know when somebody might be feeling suicidal? What kinds of things do we want to look at? So if somebody has a mental health disorder, anxiety or depression, their risk is increased, right? Especially depression, because one of the primary symptoms of depression are thoughts of suicide. So when people feel hopeless, helpless, I don't want to live anymore, that's a primary symptom of depression. So we want to pay attention to people who have depression. Same with anxiety. People have very severe anxiety, sometimes will have suicidal thoughts. People with a substance use disorder, Pat spoke very eloquently about that when people are using substances, they can often feel hopeless. Also, when your inhibitions are lowered because you're high or drunk, you might make a decision you wouldn't normally make when you had your wits about you, so to speak. So I always take people at face value when they say that they feel suicidal, even if they've said it 20,000 times before, and even if they're drunk. And I say this from personal experience. So I have a brother with serious and persistent mental illness. He has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and he has pretty much end-stage alcoholism. He's been alcoholic most of his life and drinks very, very heavily. He goes through periods of sobriety, but he has threatened to end his life on several occasions. He actually has never attempted, but I take him seriously every single time. So if he knows, if he calls me up and he makes that threat, that I'm going to call law enforcement every single time. Now he's in another state, so I don't have a lot of options about how to intervene with him. I might make another choice if he were closer, but I'm going to take him seriously every single time because I don't know when he might make that decision, right? So substance use disorder is a risk factor. People who have access to means. So when people are depressed or, they're going through a difficult time, or maybe, that diagnosed illness, if people have weapons in the house, I encourage them to get rid of those weapons, not necessarily forever, but maybe for the time being. Because when suicidal thoughts can be fleeting, they can come and go. And if they're there and then there is access to means, they are much more dangerous, right? So let's get rid of the means until those thoughts feel better. It's kind of like DUI, driving while intoxicated, right? Let's take away people's car keys so they don't make that decision to drive while intoxicated. It's really the same concept. We want to make sure that we give people safety mechanisms. If people have made an attempt before, their risk is higher. So remember I said people who die by suicide have often made previous attempts. So we know if someone's made an attempt, that then their risk is higher to die by suicide. And if someone has a family history of suicide, their risk is higher. So I've worked in hospitals a lot of my career, and people come into the hospital usually because they're a danger to themselves or others for some reason, and a lot of times following a suicide attempt. And I've had people say to me, my family would be better off without me. And I usually will respond, statistically, that's not true. So statistically, if you die by suicide, your family members are much more likely to take the same path. So maybe we want to think about other options because no one wants that for their family. So we'll talk about those things and process through it. Kids often don't think about, we talked about addicts seeing 9 days ahead. Kids don't think about the permanency of those kinds of solutions. You'll ask a kid sometimes who's come into the hospital and so, well, what did you think that would happen? And they'd say, well, everybody's going to be real mad. They're going to be standing around my coffin and they're going to feel really, really bad. And you'll say, you realize you won't be there to experience that. And they kind of don't get that concept, right? Because of the permanency, because our brains aren't quite developed yet. People who've been exposed to a suicide of another person. So we see that in kids, suicide pacts, sometimes happen in school. And then trauma. So in most mental illnesses, trauma seems to be a risk factor. So early childhood trauma. Has anyone heard of ACE scores? Yeah, adverse childhood experiences. It was actually created by a doctor who was working with severely obese women, white women, middle-aged white women who were looking for bariatric surgery. So severely obese. And he recognized that these women who fell into this category had more instances of adverse childhood experiences than the normal population. So they often grew up in homes where there were things like substance abuse in the home, mental illness in the home, domestic violence. And there's a list you can go on and you can look of adverse childhood experiences and get your score. I worked in a juvenile justice program with kids with severe and persistent. They had serious mental illness, the big ones. They also had big crimes, murder, attempted murder. So big crimes, big mental illness, bipolar, schizophrenia. They were all trauma kids. And when I looked at these kids' ACE scores, most of them had domestic violence, substance use, mental illness. A lot of them had seen someone murdered. A lot of them had seen really horrible things, horrific things, sexual abuse in their childhood, and a lot of their behaviors and the things they struggled with were probably more a result of their trauma than of their actual mental illness. So I think it's important to recognize that because, we can work on our trauma. We work on our mental illness too, but we definitely can also work on our trauma. And then stressful life circumstances certainly can lead to people who have suicidal ideation. So school, academic, disciplinary problems, bullying, we see that a lot with adolescents, relationship problems, legal problems. When people are under periods of high stress, if they don't have good coping mechanisms or resiliency and can think of what they should do or could do, sometimes they feel like they're trapped and there's no way out, and that's the only option. So what we always want to do is help people figure out what those other options are. Signs of immediate risk, things that we really want to pay attention to right away. When someone talks about or makes plans by suicide, big red flag, pay attention. We take it seriously every single time. When they feel hopeless about the future, I just don't feel like life's worth living. I don't think I can go on. Severe, overwhelming emotional pain or distress, and a marked change in behavior. So withdrawal from social connections, people not sleeping. So there's a specific pattern that goes along with major depression, difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, and what's called early morning awakening, where people will wake up about 2 or 3 a.m. and are unable to go back to sleep. And that sleep pattern is a symptom of major depression. People might feel angry or hostile, and that's out of character for them, or agitated, and irritable. So these are really immediate risk factors that we really want to pay attention to. And we may then want to get someone to a professional that they can talk to about how they feel. So language matters. I talked about the fact that I was, yes. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, you got a little ahead of me. So there's some different ways that you can do that. Some are convincing and some are more coercive. So, but we'll talk about it.
The question was, how do you get someone into treatment who doesn't want it? So I just want that for the record,
right?
For the recording.
Right. And I'm going to talk about the Baker Act law in a minute, which is one way. But I think talking to people is, and showing care and compassion and knowing the resources out there is always what we want to go to first. And there are some resources out there that are good, that sometimes people don't know about, that can kind of be a first step. So I will get to that for you. Okay. But let's talk about language. So when we think about how we talk about these things, language matters. And I said, I'm a little old school sometimes, so I even find myself falling into language that's stigmatizing, and I try not to. So we should consider saying mental health condition instead of brain disorder or brain disease, right? Because it's just a little more compassionate, right? Mental health instead of mental illness. So we want to talk about mental health. People, even with our physical health, right? Sometimes we have challenges with our physical health, and we don't always talk about people's illnesses, right? We'll talk about how you should be healthier. Consider saying my daughter has bipolar disorder rather than my daughter is bipolar, right? So we are not our illnesses. We don't say my daughter is cancer. We say my daughter has cancer. Consider saying person with mental health condition as opposed to consumer, client, or patient. So I tell you, I work in a hospital. That's really tough for us because we tend to refer to people as patients. And I try. We also tend to, in a hospital, refer to people by diagnoses. And I've kind of made it a mission, especially with behavioral health. So we have these things called huddles every day where we talk about different things. And I was in huddle one day and they were going, so we have a Baker Act in 452. And I said, you mean Mrs. Smith in 452 who's under a Baker Act? And everybody went, but I said, she's somebody's mother, somebody's sister, somebody's daughter, right? But it's easy to fall into that lingo and to forget. So I try, I'm not always 100%, and I own that, but I do try and catch it, and to think person first and not diagnosis first. Yeah, some of it did, but I do think, especially with behavioral health, we're much more likely to use stigmatizing language. So I always replace it with cancer, right? And then when you read it, it does, like when you say, and so my daughter is bipolar, we don't say my daughter is cancer. So then it starts to make a little sense. So a person who lives with or has lived experience rather than someone who suffers from, afflicted with, or has mental illness. One of the things in mental health first aid is we have artwork that goes with this course, and we talk about people with lived experience who give that art. And it's so much better than saying this is by someone who suffers from mental illness. I mean, I think it's just so much more respectful to say that this is a person who has lived experience. Suicide attempt or attempted suicide as opposed to failed suicide or unsuccessful attempt. All right. And then died by suicide or suicide death as opposed to successful or completed suicide. So we really should not think of suicide as something that's successful, right? It's really not a successful outcome. Took their own life as opposed to committed suicide. Again, committed suicide, very stigmatizing. So when we think about committed, we think about people committed crimes, they commit perjury, they're committed to an institution, right? So really very stigmatizing language, as opposed to they took their own life. and dies as a result of a self-inflicted injury as opposed to chose to kill themselves. So if you think about the fact that somebody is so depressed that that becomes an option, it's usually not really a choice. It's an outcome. And one of the things, whenever we have someone who dies by suicide, we try to look to see if we missed anything, if there was anything different we could have done. And generally it's not a choice. It's where they just had become so hopeless that they really couldn't see an option. And one of the things I'll say is sometimes mental illness is a terminal illness, just like sometimes cancer is a terminal illness, and it's not like anyone really chooses to die from cancer, but sometimes that's the outcome. And it's kind of the same with depression or other illnesses. Disclosed as opposed to threatened. So instead of saying threatened suicide, they disclosed they were thinking about it. So understanding if the crisis is immediate, we want to make sure, how do we know if the crisis is immediate and if we need to take action? At minimum, we need to ask the question. So people have a hard time asking the question. Do you feel suicidal? Have you thought about ending your life? In those words. So we'll ask it in a whole bunch of different ways. Are you feeling really bad today? Are you having any bad thoughts? Are you feeling sad? So we'll ask it that way, but we struggle to ask the direct question. So we want to say specifically, have you thought about killing yourself? And if the person says yes, then we want to say, how often have you been thinking about it? When do those thoughts happen? And have you thought of a way that you would act on them? So are they active or passive? All that gives you information, which allows us then to determine what we need to do. And remember, we're shining a light into the darkness because the person's having those thoughts. We're just bringing them out into the open. So what can we do to mitigate the risk? So if we feel like somebody's at risk, we want to put protective factors. We want to get them help, right? We want to do something to make sure that they're safer. So we want to do what we can, arrange removal of weapons. So I work with a lot of different people. So imagine working with a police officer who's thought about ending his life by suicide, right? And then tell him that we think we ought to get rid of his guns. It's not a comfortable conversation, but I've had it on a few occasions, and who are you going to call to come get them for you? But we have them, right? And I like to think that we've worked through a couple of those situations. So, and I always say, look, I'm not saying you have to get rid of your guns forever. I'm not saying, I have guns in my house. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that right now for safety, this is what we're going to do. Address the use of substances. How are you going to stay sober? Let's take the alcohol at a house. Can I go with you to a meeting? What are we going to do to make sure that you're going to stay sober? Because if you're drinking, that's going to increase your risk. We actually talk about this as risk when we talk about a safety plan. Ensure a family member or a friend. The authorities are responsible for the removal of weapons. So no one, when they talk to me and I talk about a safety plan, they say, well, I'll go home and I'll get rid of the weapons. So that doesn't really work for me, okay? Because I want to make sure you're safe. So I would really like to have somebody that you trust help you with that, all right? And I would like to talk to them to make sure that's going to happen. And it's not that I don't trust you. I just know that sometimes when people are really in despair, they sometimes change their mind. So my goal is to help you be safe. Let's look for ways to do that. And then assist in strengthening the support system. Is there anyone who can stay with you? Is there a place you can stay tonight? Can we call your pastor? Is there someone that we can do to strengthen your support system? So sometimes we can do those things to help a person. New Horizons has a mobile response team. So they have a team that'll come out to the house if the person's willing and meet with the person at the house and help with a safety plan to try and avoid hospitalization. We really only want to do hospitalization as a last resort I will tell you, 1 in 4 people walk around having thoughts of suicide. They don't go in the hospital. It's really not something everybody does. All right. And people, I used to work a lot of screening, emergency screening, and people would call and I would say, well, come in and talk to me. And they're like, oh no, you're going to put me in the hospital. I'm like, I really don't want to put a lot of people in the hospital. We don't have that many beds, right? What we want to do is work on a safety plan. So you've got to convince people that that isn't always the outcome, but never lie to somebody because it might be the outcome, right? We're going to make the best decision. If risk can't be mitigated, so if you can't convince someone to get help, you can't get them to go on their own, you can't get the mobile team out or they won't allow it, and you really, really think that they could be a danger to themselves or others, and then that is when the use of the Baker Act comes into play. It's really when safety is the main concern. It's not really what I want to go to as the first resort, but it is a tool that's in your toolbox. So Baker Act was enacted in 1971. It was named for Maxine Baker. She was a representative. She sponsored the act. And actually the act wasn't created to put people in the hospital. It was actually created to protect people's rights, because prior to 1971, any one of us, I could have gone and I said, you know, I think Pat needs to be in the state hospital. And they would have put her there for 20 years. And she wouldn't have had much to say about it, right? It was very easy to put someone in the hospitals for very long periods of time. So really, she said, in the name of mental health, we deprive people of their most precious possession, liberty. And so really, the Baker Act was put in place to protect people's rights and to make sure that they weren't able to, be held long periods of time without due process. So receiving facilities are locked hospitals that are short-term crisis units. We have 5 in our catchment area. So we have one up in Indian River County Behavioral Health Center. Lawnwood Pavilion has a hospital. Port St. Lucie Behavioral Health, it's the old Savannahs for anybody who's lived here a long time. And Coral Shores is down in Stewart. And then New Horizons has an adult and children's crisis unit. So all of those are receiving facilities. And there are different ways to initiate a Baker Act. You can call law enforcement. That's the easiest way, or go to an emergency room or call an ambulance, 911. So law enforcement can initiate one, or if a person's in an emergency room. If you go to any Cleveland Clinic emergency room, you'll see a psychiatrist via telepsychiatry, and they can evaluate the need for a Baker Act. I don't know if Lawnwood does telepsychiatry or what they do, but a lot of hospitals are doing that now. Or if a family member can go to the court and they can petition the court and do what's called an ex parte order, where they can fill out, it's about a 3-page form, and you swear to behaviors that you believe put the person at risk. A judge reviews it. If they think there's enough evidence, then they'll send law enforcement out to take the person to a hospital. Yes. Before you had 1 private, 4 public. No, they're 4 private and 1 public. Why is there even a distinction? It's funding. It's just really funding. So New Horizons is the public facility, so they treat uninsured people. But I will tell you, all the private hospitals also take care of uninsured people. But they get all the funding for uninsured people. That comes from the state. That's really the only difference. So, yes. Yes. Yep. Mm-hmm. So I think what you do is, if it's someone you care about, you love on them, right? You can't always get people the treatment that you know they need unless they're willing to get there. You get them the care they need in times of crisis. You let them know what resources are there for them, right? You love them, you care about them. You don't let them take advantage of you. Okay. So if somebody's abusing substances, et cetera, they may not be able to live in your home, but you care about them. but you aren't always going to be able to make that person get the help that you may think they need. And what I tell family members in that case is that sometimes in order to deal with that kind of situation, so I tell my mother this because I have a brother that has struggled with mental illness his whole life and substance use, and he doesn't really participate in getting well, all right? And she's 82, she's his primary caregiver. And so I tell her, encourage her to go get her own counseling in order to deal with her emotions around his behavior, right? Because we can't always change that person. You know, we have free will. You know, we have what systems are in place, but not everybody gets the help they need. And it's an unfortunate situation, but we can only, and you just have to know you've done everything that you can do and used all the resources you have. But I'm not a tough love kind of person. So I really still say love on that person, care about them, right? If they call and say they want help, get them help at that moment. If the next day they turn around and are mad because they didn't want it, say, I'm sorry, you know, I understand, and let them go on their way at that point. Does that make sense? It is not easy. It is probably one of the hardest things people have to deal with. And I won't negate that for you. So one of the things, and this is kind of goes to that point about the Baker Act, is it is for involuntary exam. It is not for involuntary admission. So it is for an examination. And a lot of times that examination happens in the emergency room, and the doctor will say, this person needs treatment, but they don't meet that criteria to hold them against their will. And people, you know, there are people out there making bad decisions in a lot of areas. You know, I work in a hospital. I see people coming in the emergency room with bad diets and diabetes and losing toes and legs and, you know, all kinds of stuff because of their diabetes, and families struggling with those decisions as well. You know, or not taking their blood pressure medication and having strokes. So we know that there are a lot of people who struggle with taking care of all kinds of health issues. You know, and you love on them and you offer them the help that you can and hope that they eventually figure out, right, that they want it. And I do believe recovery is possible, and I do believe people get there. And we can talk more after, you know, if you want to talk more after. So in involuntary exam, I'm not going to go through all of this, but basically it's if a person has mental illness and is a danger to themselves or others, and they don't have anybody willing and able to help provide for their safety. So there's a very high bar to write a Baker Act and hold someone against their will. It's a very, very high bar. Okay, so how do we respond when people talk about suicide? How should we respond? How do we get them help? Well, first of all, we ask if they're okay, right? We let them know we're willing to sit, we're willing to listen, we're willing to talk to them, that it doesn't scare us to talk about it, and that we want to be present for them in those feelings. Express your concern, you know, be specific about what you see in their behavior. You know, I noticed that you haven't been sleeping. I noticed that you haven't been showering lately. You know, I'm worried about you. You've been late to work several days this week. You've been drinking more than usual. Be specific, but don't be accusing. You know, I'm concerned about you. I want to help. Express your concern. Listen attentively, but non-judgmentally. That's sometimes hard, right? We want to give people advice. I tell you, I a lot of times want to tell my brother what to do because I know what to do. You know, I can tell him, I know what will get you better. You know, you just need to listen to me, but that doesn't work. I tried it several times. Doesn't work, right? So you listen. Reflect on what they share and let them know they've been heard. Repeat it back to them. You know, that must be very challenging for you. That must be very difficult. Let them know they're not alone. Let them know you're available, you know, if they want to talk. Let them know treatment can help. Recovery is possible and probable, and guide them to professional help. So and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, so I'm not getting ahead of myself. And then follow up with them. You know, if somebody calls and they're despondent and they're talking, call them the next day, check on them. How are you doing? You know, let them know that you heard them and you want to be there for them. Know the types of care that are out there. So if you really want to know what to do, take a mental health first aid course. There are all kinds of them around. You can go Google mental health first aid. You can find them. It's an 8-hour course. And it'll teach you how to have those conversations, how to talk about it. I like to call it the CPR for mental health. So if you think about CPR, if you find someone on the side of the road having a heart attack, right? We don't perform heart surgery, do we? No open heart on the side of the road. We do chest compressions, call 911 and get them help, right? We life save. It's the same with mental health first aid. Recognize the signs of what's going on, help them in the moment, get them to professional help. So mental health first aid is a great way to learn that. And then this is new as of July. So we now have a national suicide hotline. And if you're with someone and you don't know what to say, let's call this line together. I'll dial it. Here's my phone. You can talk to the people. So 988 is the new suicide hotline. It's the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and they have trained crisis care counselors there to talk. That's my presentation. I hope it's been helpful, and I appreciate your time tonight.
The 988 call, what is that conversation like?
So it's probably a crisis counselor who's going to have a very similar conversation to what we just talked about. So how are you feeling? You know, what thoughts have you been having? Why do you think you've been having those thoughts? Let's think of a safety plan. They'll look for the resources that are available in your area. They might help call like a mobile crisis team to come out and talk with you, but they're going to talk through how you're feeling and the crisis that you're going through. And I believe they'll spend as much time as you need on the phone talking through it. Any other questions? Sure.
Question earlier about how do you access a professional or site
Yep.
or
Lots of different.
kind of professional?
Yeah, there are lots of different ways to do that. So there are all kinds of different professionals out there. You know, you have psychiatrists, there are counselors, social workers, right? There are peer support groups, a lot of different things. So there's some walk-in places. New Horizons has a walk-in screening department. In Indian River County, Mental Health Association has a walk-in. Most emergency rooms have access to behavioral care. You can go in and get an evaluation or an assessment. So there are a lot of those kinds of things. If you're working, a lot of workplaces have employee assistance programs. So for instance, we have one, we get 6 free visits via telehealth. We can talk to a counselor. Health insurance, if you hold health insurance. Yeah, if you hold health insurance, a lot of times you just call your health insurance provider and they'll tell you who's on your provider list and who you can call and help you get an appointment. And then 211 is a great resource. So 211 is our local social service line. And you can call 211 for just about anything. If you need food resources, rent, if you need mental health resources, just about anything, and they'll connect you. And you can go online and look at 211 as well. 211? No, 211, yeah. Yep. And you can actually go online and search for just about any resource. They have domestic violence, just about anything. Any other questions? Okay, we can talk. Yeah. All right. All right. I appreciate you all coming out tonight. Thank you so much.